The morning sun streamed through the windows of Terminal B as James Wilson checked his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. The airport buzzed with the usual chaos. Families herding children, business travelers glued to phones, and airline staff navigating the controlled mayhem with practiced smiles. For James, this was just another Monday, another flight, another city. As the founder and CEO of RiverEdge Technologies, one of the fastest-growing software companies in the country, James had grown accustomed to living out of a suitcase. The company he had built from nothing now employed over 500 people and was valued at just shy of $1 billion, a fact that still sometimes left him shaking his head in disbelief when he allowed himself a rare moment to reflect. Final boarding call for Transglobal Airways Flight 372 to Chicago. The announcement crackled over the loudspeaker, pulling James back to the present. He gathered his carry-on and laptop bag, making his way to the priority lane. The gate agent's face lit up with recognition as she scanned his boarding pass. "Good morning, Mr. Wilson. Thank you for flying with us today. We're honored to have you aboard," she said, her voice warm and genuine. James smiled back, thanking her as he made his way down the jet bridge. The first-class cabin was already half full when James arrived. He nodded politely to his fellow passengers as he found his window seat. After stowing his bags in the overhead compartment, he settled in, immediately pulling out his phone to check his messages before takeoff. The board meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning in Chicago had been months in the making. Potential investors who could help take RiverEdge to the next level. "Can I get you something to drink before takeoff, sir?" A flight attendant appeared at his side, her name tag reading Diane. Her smile seemed forced, not quite reaching her eyes. "Just water, please," James replied, returning to his emails. The plane filled quickly, and soon the captain's voice came over the intercom, welcoming everyone aboard and announcing their flight time of 3 hours and 20 minutes to Chicago. As the safety demonstration began, James finally allowed himself to power down his phone and close his eyes. The past week had been brutal. 18-hour days finalizing the presentation for tomorrow's meeting, endless calls with his executive team, and barely any sleep. James felt the familiar sensation of the plane lifting off, climbing through turbulent air before finally leveling out at cruising altitude. The seatbelt sign dinged off and he reclined his seat slightly, hoping to get at least an hour of rest before landing. Sleep had been a luxury lately, and his body was starting to rebel against the constant strain. He must have dozed off because the next thing he felt was a sharp pain in his shoulder, jolting him awake. The drink cart had collided with him, hard enough to leave what would likely become a bruise. Behind the cart stood a different flight attendant from earlier. Her name tag read Beth. She barely glanced at him as she continued serving drinks to the passenger across the aisle. "Excuse me," James said, his voice still groggy from sleep. "You hit me pretty hard with the cart." Beth continued pouring a drink for another passenger, not acknowledging him at all. "Ma'am?" James tried again, a bit louder this time. "The cart hit my shoulder." Beth finally turned toward him, her expression unreadable. "The aisle is narrow. These things happen." She pushed the cart forward without offering an apology or asking if he was all right. James sat up straighter, taken aback by the dismissive response. In his position, he had encountered varying levels of service over the years, but rarely such blatant disregard. "I understand accidents happen," he said calmly, "but an apology would be appropriate." Beth turned back, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Sir, I have a cabin full of passengers to serve. If you have a complaint, you can file it with customer service after we land." Her tone carried an edge that was impossible to miss. The passenger seated across from James, an older man with silver hair, looked up from his book with raised eyebrows. Another passenger, a woman in a business suit, was watching the interaction with growing interest. "I'm not filing a complaint," James clarified, keeping his voice measured. "I'm simply asking for basic courtesy after being hit with a heavy cart." Beth's posture stiffened. "I'm doing my job, sir. Please don't make this difficult." She turned away again, moving to the next row of seats. James took a deep breath, feeling a familiar weight settle in his chest. As one of the few black executives in the tech industry, he had navigated countless situations where he had to carefully measure his reactions. Show too much emotion, and he'd be labeled aggressive. Say nothing and the disrespect would continue. It was an exhausting tightrope that he never got to step off. The woman in the business suit had pulled out her phone now, subtly angling it toward the interaction. James noticed but chose to ignore it. This was hardly the first time he'd been recorded in public, though usually it was for speaking engagements or industry events. Not this. "Excuse me," the silver-haired man across the aisle called out to Beth as she returned with more drinks. "I saw what happened, and this gentleman deserves an apology. That cart hit him hard enough that I heard it." Beth's face flushed. "Sir, I'm just trying to complete the service. We're experiencing turbulence and accidents happen." "There wasn't any turbulence," another passenger chimed in from the row behind. "I was watching. You weren't paying attention and rammed right into his shoulder." The cabin had grown quieter now, with several nearby passengers turning to observe the unfolding scene. James felt the unwelcome spotlight on him grow brighter. This was exactly the kind of attention he tried to avoid while traveling. He valued his privacy and the rare moments of anonymity that came with being away from his company headquarters. Beth looked around the cabin, seeming to realize that multiple passengers had witnessed the incident. Her expression hardened as she leaned toward James. "Sir, if you continue to disrupt the cabin service, I'll need to notify the captain," she said, her voice low but loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Disrupt?" James repeated, genuinely confused. "I asked for an apology after being hit with a cart. How is that disruptive?" The business suit woman was definitely recording now, not even attempting to be subtle about it. Two other passengers had pulled out their phones as well. "This is ridiculous," a young woman 2 rows ahead said loudly. "All he asked for was an apology." "I've been watching this whole thing." Beth's face had gone from flushed to pale. She reached for the cabin phone. "I need to speak with the captain about a situation in first class," she said into the receiver, her eyes never leaving James. The cabin erupted in murmurs. The silver-haired man stood up. "This is outrageous. I'm a retired pilot with 40 years of experience, and I've never seen such unprofessional behavior from a flight attendant." James felt his heart rate accelerating despite his outwardly calm demeanor. What had started as a simple request for an apology was spiraling into something much larger, something all too familiar. He'd seen this pattern before. A minor incident involving a black person somehow becoming treated as a threat. He reached for his wallet, removing his company ID and a business card. "My name is James Wilson. I'm the CEO of River Edge Technologies," he said calmly, placing his credentials on his tray table. "I'm not being disruptive. I'm not being aggressive. I simply asked for an apology after being hit with a drink cart, which is a reasonable request by any standard." The business suit woman, who had been recording, suddenly spoke up. "I'm Vanessa Chen, travel editor for Business Weekly. I've been documenting this entire interaction, and I have to say, in 15 years of covering the travel industry, I've never seen anything quite like this." Beth's eyes widened as she looked from Vanessa to James's credentials. The realization of who she was dealing with, and that it was being documented by a journalist, seemed to hit her all at once. The plane's chief flight attendant, a tall woman with a streak of gray in her dark hair, appeared from the front of the cabin. "What seems to be the problem here?" she asked, her eyes moving between Beth and James. Before Beth could speak, the silver-haired retired pilot explained what had happened. Several other passengers nodded in agreement with his account. "I see," the chief flight attendant said, her expression grave. She turned to James. "Sir, on behalf of Transglobal Airways, I want to apologize for this incident. I assure you this is not representative of our service standards. If you'll allow me, I'd like to speak with you privately about making this right." James nodded, feeling the eyes of the entire cabin on him. Meanwhile, Vanessa Chen was typing rapidly on her phone. The silver-haired man returned to his seat, giving James a supportive nod. Beth had been pulled aside by the chief flight attendant, their hushed conversation just barely audible. Beth's face had drained of all color as she repeatedly glanced back at James, and then at Vanessa Chen, the reality of the situation apparently sinking in. What none of them realized in that moment was that Vanessa Chen's live updates from the flight had already begun trending on social media. By the time they reached Chicago, your transglobal incident would be the top trending topic nationwide, and the airline's stock would take its first of many hits in what would become a corporate crisis unlike anything the industry had seen before. And all of it, the viral outrage, the stock plunge, the congressional inquiry that would follow, all of it began with a drink cart, a dismissive response, and a simple request for an apology that went unheeded. As the chief flight attendant returned to speak with him, James had no way of knowing that in less than 10 minutes, the entire trajectory of Transglobal Airways, one of the country's largest airlines, would begin its dramatic and very public implosion. The chief flight attendant, whose name tag read Helen, led James to the small galley area at the front of the first-class cabin. Her face carried the worried look of someone who knew a situation was quickly spinning beyond control. "Mr. Wilson, I want to personally apologize for what happened," Helen said, her voice low and sincere. "Beth is fairly new to our airline. That doesn't excuse her behavior, but I want you to know this isn't how we train our staff." James nodded, still feeling the dull throb in his shoulder where the cart had hit him. "I appreciate that, Helen. All I wanted was a simple acknowledgement and apology." "That's it." Helen glanced nervously toward the cabin where several passengers were still watching them, phones in hand. "I understand. The captain has been notified of the situation, and he's asked to speak with you after we land if you're willing." "That's fine," James replied. What he didn't say was that he had already received 3 text messages from his communications director back at River Edge Technologies. Somehow word had gotten out. As James returned to his seat, he checked his phone. The texts from his communications director, Lucia, were increasingly urgent. "James, there's video of an incident on your flight trending. Call me ASAP. This is getting serious. Transglobal incident is trending nationwide. CNN picking it up. PR crisis team assembled. Need to hear from you directly. How bad is it?" James looked up to see Vanessa Chen, the Business Weekly travel editor, watching him from across the aisle. She gave him a small nod, then returned to her phone where she was rapidly typing. The silver-haired retired pilot leaned across the aisle. "The way they treated you was unacceptable," he said quietly. "I'm Thomas Reynolds, by the way. Flew for Continental for 40 years before they merged." "James Wilson," he replied, shaking Thomas's hand. "Thanks for speaking up earlier." "Didn't do it for thanks," Thomas said with a shrug. "Did it because it was right. I saw exactly what happened." The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, and James noticed Beth stumble slightly as she made her way down the aisle, deliberately avoiding eye contact with him. The passengers watched her like hawks, the atmosphere in the cabin thick with tension. James's phone buzzed with an incoming call from Lucia. He considered letting it go to voicemail. He hated discussing business where others could overhear. But given the circumstances, he answered. "I'm still on the flight," he said quietly. "James." "This is exploding online." Lucia's voice came through, tight with concern. "There are already 3 different videos circulating. People are calling for boycotts of Transglobal. The airline's stock dropped 4% in the last 7 minutes. James closed his eyes, feeling a wave of exhaustion wash over him. "All I did was ask for an apology after getting hit with a drink cart." "I know," Lucia replied. "The videos make that clear. You were completely reasonable. That's why people are so angry on your behalf. This is touching a nerve, especially coming just weeks after that coffee shop incident with Congressman Parker. The congressman's situation had been similar. A black elected official being treated with suspicion and disrespect at a coffee chain. The company's ham-fisted response had only made things worse, leading to nationwide protests and boycotts. I need you to listen carefully," Lucia continued. "When you land, there will likely be media waiting. Transglobal's PR team has already released a statement that's not great." "What did they say?" James asked, dreading the answer. "They said they're investigating an incident involving a passenger who became confrontational with crew members. They didn't name you, but they're painting me as the aggressor." James finished the thought, a familiar heaviness settling in his chest. "Exactly. We need to get ahead of this. I've drafted a statement from you that's measured but firm. I can send it to your email to review." James agreed, then ended the call, noticing that more passengers were now openly watching him. Some offered sympathetic smiles. Others looked curious, clearly trying to connect him to whatever was trending online. His phone buzzed again with an incoming text, this time from his wife, Leah. "Are you okay? Just saw the news. Call me when you can." Before he could respond, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Westfield speaking. We've begun our initial descent into Chicago. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for landing." The announcement broke some of the tension in the cabin, As passengers reluctantly stowed their phones and returned their seats to the upright position, Helen appeared at James's side. "Mr. Wilson, the captain would like you to stay seated after we land until the other passengers have deplaned," she said quietly. "He'd like a word with you, and there seems to be some media attention at the gate." James nodded, unsurprised. "Thank you for letting me know." As the plane descended through the clouds over Chicago, James reviewed the statement Lucia had sent. It was straightforward and professional, focusing on the facts without inflaming the situation. He made a few small edits, then approved it for release. The wheels touched down with a squeal and the plane taxied to the gate. As passengers began gathering their belongings, James remained seated as requested. He noticed Vanessa Chen lingering as well, though she pretended to be busy organizing her laptop bag. "Mr. Wilson," Thomas Reynolds said as he stood to leave, "I've given my contact information to the flight attendant. If you need a witness to what happened, I'm happy to speak up." "I appreciate that," James replied, genuinely touched by the man's integrity. As the last passengers filed out, James could see through the windows of the jet bridge. Flashes from cameras lit up the terminal beyond. Helen approached with a tall man in a pilot's uniform. "Mr. Wilson, this is Captain Westfield," she introduced. The captain extended his hand, his expression grave. "Mr. Wilson, I want to apologize personally for what happened on my aircraft today. I've reviewed the situation with my crew and spoken with several passengers. It's clear that you were treated inappropriately." "Thank you, Captain," James replied, shaking his hand. "I should warn you," Captain Westfield continued, lowering his voice. "There's quite a media presence at the gate. Our corporate office has sent representatives who are waiting in the terminal. They're hoping to speak with you." James nodded. "I understand. I've already prepared a statement. There's a private exit we can use if you prefer to avoid the cameras," the captain offered. James considered this for a moment, then shook his head. "No, thank you. I'll exit normally. I have nothing to hide or be ashamed of." As they walked toward the jet bridge, Vanessa Chen fell into step beside them. "Mr. Wilson, I'd like to ask you a few questions for Business Weekly if you have a moment." Before he could respond, his phone rang again. It was River Edge's general counsel, David. "James, where are you right now?" David asked without preamble. "About to exit the plane in Chicago." "Why?" "TransGlobal's CEO just called me directly. They're in full damage control mode. Their stock has fallen 12% in the last half hour. They're asking for a private meeting with you before you make any public statements." James paused at the entrance to the jet bridge. "What's your advice?" "Hear them out, but don't agree to anything on the spot." Their initial statement was tone-deaf at best, potentially defamatory at worst. "They're scrambling." "Understood," James said, ending the call and turning to Vanessa. "Ms. Chen, I'll have time for questions later. Right now I need to handle the situation." She nodded, still typing notes into her phone. "Fair enough. But you should know that TransGlobal's CEO just arrived at the airport. His car was spotted at the VIP entrance 5 minutes ago." James stepped into the terminal and was immediately met with a wall of flashing cameras and shouted questions. A group of airport security officers moved forward to create a path for him. "Mr. Wilson, can you tell us what happened on the flight? Is it true you were assaulted by a TransGlobal employee? How do you respond to TransGlobal's statement suggesting you were confrontational?" James held up a hand and remarkably the shouting subsided. Years of leading boardroom discussions and press conferences had taught him how to command a room with quiet authority. "I'll be making a full statement shortly," he said calmly. "For now, I'll simply say that what happened today reflects a broader issue that many people face daily. I was treated with disrespect after politely asking for an apology when a flight attendant hit me with a drink cart. The incident was documented by multiple passengers, and I'm grateful to those who spoke up." A hushed murmur ran through the crowd of reporters. Before more questions could be shouted, a group of suits pushed through the crowd. At their center was a man James recognized immediately, Richard Harmon, CEO of TransGlobal Airways. "Mr. Wilson," Harmon said, extending his hand with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'd like to personally apologize for today's incident and invite you to speak privately." The cameras continued to flash around them, capturing what was quickly becoming a historic moment in corporate crisis management, or mismanagement, as it would later be described in business school case studies. James shook Harmon's hand firmly. aware that every move was being watched, recorded, and would soon be analyzed across social media platforms and news outlets worldwide. "Mr. Harmon," he replied, his voice steady and clear enough for the nearby microphones to pick up. "I appreciate you coming personally. I think we do indeed need to talk." What neither man fully grasped in that moment was that their conversation would set in motion a chain of events that would not only reshape transglobal airways but would force a national reckoning on how corporations handled issues of respect, dignity, and racial bias. The clock was ticking on transglobal's future, and the next few hours would prove decisive. As James followed Harmon toward the airport's VIP lounge, his phone buzzed with a news alert. Transglobal Airways stock halts trading after 20% drop following viral incident with tech CEO. The airline's implosion had begun in earnest. The VIP lounge of Chicago O'Hare Airport had been hastily cleared of other travelers. Only James, Richard Harmon, and a small group of executives remained. Large windows overlooked the tarmac where planes took off and landed in the afternoon sun, oblivious to the crisis unfolding inside. "Again, Mr. Wilson, I want to extend our deepest apologies," Harmon said, his voice carrying the polished smoothness of someone who had navigated many corporate storms before. "What happened on that flight doesn't reflect our company values." James sat across from him, hands folded calmly on the table between them. His years as a CEO had taught him to read people quickly, and everything about Harmon screamed damage control rather than genuine concern. "I appreciate that, Mr. Harmon," James replied. "But I'm curious about the statement your company released while I was still in the air, the one describing me as confrontational with crew members." A flash of discomfort crossed Harmon's face. Beside him, a woman in a charcoal suit, introduced earlier as Kimberly Wells, Transglobal's chief communications officer, shifted in her seat. "That was an unfortunate miscommunication based on preliminary reports," Harmon said, glancing briefly at Wells. "We've already retracted that statement and issued a new one." "I see," James said, noting how quickly the blame had been shifted to unnamed, preliminary reports rather than acknowledging the company's rush to paint him as the aggressor. "And the flight attendant involved? Beth, I believe, was her name. She's been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation," Wells interjected, her voice clipped and professional. "We take these matters very seriously, Mr. Wilson." Outside the lounge, James could see reporters gathering, their cameras pointed toward the frosted glass doors. His phone had been buzzing nonstop with notifications, which he'd silenced upon entering the meeting. "I think we all know the situation has grown beyond a simple incident on an airplane," James said, turning his attention back to Harmon. "The videos are spreading. Your stock has been halted after falling 20%. People are angry not just about what happened to me, but what it represents." Harmon nodded gravely, though James noticed the slight tightening around his eyes, the look of a CEO calculating losses and liabilities rather than considering the human impact. "We'd like to offer you compensation." "Of course," Harmon said, "and we're hoping you might consider a joint statement. Something that acknowledges our swift response and your satisfaction with how we've handled the situation." There it was, the real purpose of this meeting. They wanted him to help them save face, to put his stamp of approval on their handling of a crisis that was still unfolding. James took a moment before responding, thinking about the countless times he'd been in situations where his dignity was challenged, where he was expected to accept less than basic respect because making a fuss would be confrontational. He thought about the younger employees at his company who looked up to him, who faced these same struggles daily. "Mr. Harmon, I'm not interested in compensation," James said finally, "and I won't be making a joint statement today." The atmosphere in the room chilled noticeably. Wells exchanged a glance with the company's legal counsel, a thin man who had been silently taking notes throughout the meeting. "Perhaps you'd like some time to consider," Harmon began, but James cut him off with a raised hand. "What I'm interested in is meaningful change," James continued. "Your flight attendant didn't just fail to apologize for hitting me with a cart. She threatened to report me to the captain for simply asking for that apology. She made me, a first-class passenger and frequent flyer with your airline, feel unwelcome and suspect, and your company's first instinct was to label me as the problem. Mr. Wilson, I assure you—" "I'm not finished," James said calmly but firmly. "This isn't about me getting special treatment because I'm a CEO. It's about every passenger being treated with basic dignity. It's about your company culture that apparently trains staff to see certain passengers as threats rather than customers. That's what people are responding to in those videos. Wells cleared her throat. We have extensive diversity training programs for all staff, Mr. Wilson. This was an isolated incident. James turned to her with a skeptical look. Was it? Because I've already received hundreds of messages from people sharing similar experiences on your airline. Some of them have videos too. This was true. During the flight, as the initial videos spread, his social media accounts had been flooded with messages from people who had faced similar treatment, not just on Transglobal but across the travel industry. Harmon's face had grown increasingly tense. What exactly are you looking for here, Mr. Wilson? James leaned forward. Transparency. A full review of your training practices, an independent audit of how your airline handles customer complaints, especially those involving bias, and a commitment to making structural changes based on what you find. That's extensive, the legal counsel spoke for the first time, his voice cautious. So is the damage to your brand right now, James replied evenly. His phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Lucia that he couldn't ignore. Excuse me, I need to take this, he said, stepping away from the table. James, Lucia's voice was urgent. CNN is reporting that Transglobal has a history of customer complaints, specifically from Black and brown passengers. Someone leaked internal documents showing they've been tracking these incidents but taking no action. This is getting much bigger. James felt a mixture of anger and vindication. How reliable is this information? Very. The documents appear legitimate. They're from a whistleblower inside Transglobal's customer service department. Social media is erupting. Our transglobal racism is now trending above our transglobal incident. James thanked her and returned to the table, where Harmon was engaged in a hushed conversation with his team. They fell silent as James approached. Mr. Harmon, it seems we have more to discuss, James said, taking his seat again. I've just been informed about leaked internal documents showing your company has been tracking complaints of biased treatment, but has taken no substantive action. The blood drained from Harmon's face. The legal counsel hurriedly whispered something to him, but Harmon waved him off. I'm not aware of any such documents, Harmon said carefully. They're being reported on CNN right now, James replied. And given that I just suggested an independent audit of exactly these issues, your lack of awareness is concerning. The door to the lounge opened and an assistant rushed in, whispering urgently to Wells, whose eyes widened. She quickly showed something on her tablet to Harmon, whose expression turned from concern to alarm. Mr. Wilson, Harmon said, his voice noticeably less confident. Perhaps we should continue this discussion later, after we've had a chance to review these alleged documents. I think that's wise, James agreed, standing. In the meantime, I'll be making my own statement to the press, not about specific demands or negotiations with your company, but about the broader issues this incident has highlighted. We would prefer if you didn't speak to the press until we've had a chance to. That's not your decision to make, James said simply, gathering his things. I've been more than reasonable, Mr. Harmon. I came to this meeting in good faith, but I won't be silenced or managed. As James moved toward the door, Harmon called after him. Mr. Wilson, please reconsider. We can work together on this. You had a chance to work with me, James replied, turning back one last time. You chose to try to manage me instead. Now you'll have to deal with the consequences of that choice. He pushed through the doors into the terminal, where reporters immediately swarmed around him. Cameras flashed and microphones were thrust forward. He spotted Vanessa Chen from Business Weekly at the front of the crowd. Mr. Wilson, can you tell us what transpired in that meeting? She called out. James took a deep breath, centered himself, and addressed the gathered press with the essay. Me calm confidence he brought to every board meeting and product launch. Today started with a simple request for an apology after a flight attendant hit me with a drink cart, he began. That request was met with hostility and threats rather than basic courtesy. What happened to me on that flight happens to people every day. People who don't have the platform or privilege that I do to speak up about it. The reporters had gone surprisingly quiet. Cameras rolling as he continued. This isn't just about one flight attendant or one airline. It's about a culture that too often sees certain passengers as problems, rather than as customers deserving respect. It's about companies that rush to manage crises, rather than prevent them through meaningful change. From the corner of his eye, James could see Harmon and his team watching from just inside the lounge, their faces grim. I believe in accountability, in transparency, and in the power of institutions to become better when they acknowledge their failings honestly. I hope Transglobal Airways will take this opportunity to do exactly that. As he finished speaking, his phone lit up with a news alert. Transglobal Airways Board of Directors calls emergency meeting amid escalating crisis. The airline's implosion was accelerating, and the next 24 hours would determine whether anything would remain when the dust settled. James finally reached his hotel room after navigating through the media circus at the airport. The moment the door closed behind him, he loosened his tie and sank into the nearest chair, feeling the weight of the day settling on his shoulders. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing since his press statement, and his inbox was overflowing with messages from colleagues, friends, and strangers alike. He called his wife, Leah. "First, James," her voice was a mix of concern and relief. "I've been watching everything. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," he assured her, though the tension headache building behind his eyes suggested otherwise. "Just tired. It's been a long day. The kids have been watching too. Zoe's especially proud. She keeps telling her friends that her dad is standing up to injustice." There was a smile in Leah's voice now. The thought of his 13-year-old daughter watching these events unfold made James pause. He'd always tried to show his children how to handle difficult situations with dignity and principle, but he never expected to become a public example of it. "Tell her I'm just doing what we've always taught them to do," he said softly. After finishing his call with Leah, James checked the news. Transglobal's emergency board meeting was already underway, according to business channels. The airline's stock would resume trading tomorrow morning, and analysts were predicting further declines. Transglobal racism was now the top trending topic nationwide, with people sharing stories of similar experiences across all airlines, but especially Transglobal. His phone rang again, Lucia calling with updates. "The whistleblower documents are legitimate," she said without preamble. "They show Transglobal has received over 2,000 complaints of discriminatory treatment in the past 3 years alone. They categorized them internally as subjective passenger grievances and took minimal action." "Who's the whistleblower?" James asked. "A former customer service manager named Priya Kumar. She tried to raise these issues internally for years before leaving the company. She's gone public now. She's doing an interview with CNN in 20 minutes. James turned on the television just in time to see Priya Kumar, a woman in her 40s with a determined expression, sitting across from the news anchor. "I collected these complaints for years," she was saying, her voice steady despite her obvious nervousness. "I compiled reports, showed patterns, proposed solutions. But every time I was told these were isolated incidents or subjective interpretations by passengers. After your incident today, Mr. Wilson, I couldn't stay silent anymore." The anchor leaned forward. "And what was Transglobal's official policy regarding these complaints?" "The official policy was to offer flight vouchers and form apologies," Kumar replied. "But unofficially, we were told to watch for excessive complaints from certain passengers who might be using the race card to get compensation. Those were the exact words used in training sessions." James watched, feeling a complex mix of emotions. There was anger at the systematic dismissal of people's experiences, but also a sense of validation. This was exactly what he'd suspected during his meeting with Harmon. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Mr. Wilson, this is Thomas Reynolds, the retired pilot from your flight today. Thought you should know that several Transglobal flight attendants are organizing to speak out about the training practices. They want to talk to you first." Before he could respond, another call came in. His board chairman, Victor Chen. "James," Victor said, his usually calm voice edged with concern. "How are you holding up?" "I'm managing," James replied. "But our board meeting tomorrow is no longer about potential investors," Victor finished the thought. "It's about how River Edge responds to this situation. You've become the face of something much bigger than one incident on a plane." James sighed, rubbing his temples. "That wasn't my intention, Victor. I know. But sometimes leadership finds us in unexpected moments. The question now is, what do we do with this platform?" It was a good question, one James had been pondering since his statement at the airport. This wasn't just about him or even just about Transglobal anymore. It had tapped into a deeper conversation about dignity, respect, and whose complaints were taken seriously in corporate America. "I need to think about it," James said. "Get some rest first." "Good idea," Victor agreed. "But James, the board is behind you 100%, whatever direction you decide to take this." After ending the call, James checked social media one last time before trying to get some sleep. CEOs for Respect was now trending alongside the trans-global hashtags, with business leaders across the country voicing support for his stance. And then he saw it. A statement from Trans-Global Airways posted just minutes ago. Following our emergency board meeting, Trans-Global Airways announces that CEO Richard Harmon has stepped down, effective immediately. The board acknowledges serious failures in our training, customer service, and corporate response systems. We are committed to a complete overhaul of our practices and culture, beginning with the appointment of an interim CEO and an independent task force to audit all aspects of our customer experience. The airline's implosion had claimed its first executive casualty, and James knew there would be more to come. Morning arrived after a restless night. James had barely finished his first cup of coffee when his phone rang, the same unknown number from the night before. "Mr. Wilson? Thomas Reynolds again. Sorry to bother you so early, but there's something you should see." James turned on the television to find all the morning shows covering a remarkable scene at Chicago O'Hare. Over 100 trans-global flight attendants had staged an impromptu gathering in the main terminal, many holding signs reading "Respect for all passengers" and "Change trans-global culture." Their spokesperson, a flight attendant with 20 years of experience named Diane Wilson, no relation to James, was addressing the cameras. "What happened yesterday on Flight 372 was the result of systemic issues in our training and culture," she stated firmly. "Many of us have tried to address these problems internally for years. We love our jobs and our passengers, but we've been working in a system that sometimes trains us to view certain passengers with suspicion rather than respect." James watched, amazed at how quickly events were unfolding. The flight attendant's action was unprecedented, employees publicly acknowledging problems within their own company while still employed there. His phone buzzed with a text from Lucia. "Turn to CNBC now." He switched channels to see Trans-Global stock had resumed trading and immediately plunged another 15%. The ticker along the bottom of the screen showed other major airlines also taking hits as investors worried about industry-wide exposure to similar issues. There was a knock at his hotel room door. James opened it to find a hotel manager looking apologetic. "Mr. Wilson, I'm sorry to disturb you, but there's a Ms. Wells from Trans-Global Airways in the lobby. She says it's urgent that she speak with you." Kimberly Wells, the same communications officer who had been in yesterday's meeting. James considered sending her away but decided against it. Send her up. When Wells arrived, she looked like she hadn't slept. The polished corporate veneer from yesterday had cracked, revealing genuine stress underneath. "Mr. Wilson, thank you for seeing me," she said, declining his offer to sit. "I'm here without the knowledge of our board. They appointed me interim CEO an hour ago." James raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Congratulations?" "It's not a congratulatory situation," she replied with surprising candor. "I've been tasked with saving a company that might not deserve saving, at least not in its current form." Her honesty caught him off guard. "That's not what I expected you to say." "Yesterday opened my eyes," Wells admitted. "After our meeting, I reviewed the whistleblower documents myself. They're real, and they're worse than what's been reported. I've been part of a system that's been dismissing legitimate concerns for years, categorizing them as perception issues rather than real problems." James studied her carefully. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I want your help," she said simply. "Not for a PR statement or damage control. I want your help to genuinely transform this airline. The board has given me full authority to make sweeping changes, and I intend to use it." It was the last thing James had expected. Not an adversary looking to manage him, but a potential ally acknowledging the depth of the problem. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked cautiously. "I want you to help lead an independent commission on airline service standards and bias training. Not just for Trans-Global, but industry-wide. We'd be the first to adopt whatever recommendations emerge, but the goal would be to create new benchmarks for the entire industry." James was silent for a moment, weighing the sincerity of her proposal. Why should I trust this isn't just another attempt at crisis management? Wells met his gaze directly. Because I'm putting everything on the line. If this commission finds that our training explicitly encouraged profiling passengers, which I now suspect it did, I'll be accountable for implementing the changes or stepping down if I can't deliver them. As James considered her offer, breaking news flashed across the television screen. The Department of Transportation had just announced a formal investigation into customer service practices across all major airlines, citing the transglobal incident as a catalyst. The airline's implosion had sparked a movement far beyond what anyone could have predicted just 24 hours earlier, when a drink cart hit a passenger's shoulder. I'll consider it, James said finally, but first I need to see those internal documents myself, all of them. And I'll need to talk to your flight attendants, not just the ones protesting, but also Beth, the one from my flight. Wells nodded. Whatever you need. Transparency from this point forward. As she left, James turned back to the television where the flight attendants' protest had grown even larger, with passengers now joining in solidarity. Something remarkable was happening. A movement was forming around a simple premise that everyone deserved to be treated with basic dignity, regardless of who they were. His phone buzzed with a message from Victor. Board meeting in 1 hour via video conference. Big decisions ahead. You ready? James texted back a single word. Ready. The next few days would determine not just the fate of Transglobal Airways, but potentially how an entire industry approached the fundamental concept of respect. And it had all begun with a request for a simple apology. 6 months later, James Wilson stood at the podium in Transglobal Airways headquarters, looking out over a packed auditorium. Executives, flight attendants, pilots, ground crew, and media representatives filled every seat. The mood was solemn yet hopeful, a stark contrast to the chaos that had erupted half a year earlier. Today marks not an ending, but a beginning, James said, his voice carrying clearly through the room. 6 months ago, a drink cart hit my shoulder on a flight to Chicago. What followed was not just the implosion of an airline, but the start of a necessary conversation about respect, dignity, and accountability in how we treat each other. In the front row sat Kimberly Wells, who had surprised everyone by proving to be a genuine agent for change as Transglobal's interim CEO. Beside her was Thomas Reynolds, the retired pilot who had spoken up on that fateful flight and had since become a key advisor on the independent commission James now headed. The Airline Service Standards Commission is releasing its final report today, James continued, gesturing to the thick-bound documents being distributed throughout the room. Its findings and recommendations reflect 6 months of interviews, data analysis, and hard conversations about biases we often don't want to acknowledge. The journey to this moment had been anything but smooth. In the weeks following the incident, Transglobal's stock had fallen nearly 40%. Several board members had resigned. Class action lawsuits had been filed by passengers who had experienced similar treatment. The airline had teetered on the edge of bankruptcy, but something unexpected had also happened. Under Wells's leadership, Transglobal had taken the unprecedented step of complete transparency. They had released all the whistleblower documents, opened their training manuals to public scrutiny, and committed to implementing whatever recommendations the independent commission proposed. Our commission identified 5 critical areas requiring immediate reform, James explained, flipping to the executive summary. First, training protocols that explicitly or implicitly encourage staff to view certain passengers with heightened suspicion based on race, religion, or appearance. Second, complaint systems designed to minimize rather than address passenger concerns. Third, corporate cultures that prioritize defending the company over honest self-assessment. Fourth, lack of diversity in leadership positions that might otherwise identify problematic patterns. And fifth, industry-wide metrics that prioritize efficiency over humanity. From his seat in the second row, Victor Chen, River Edge's board chairman, gave James a subtle nod of approval. The past 6 months had been challenging for James's own company, too. His sudden thrust into the national spotlight had initially distracted from River Edge's core business. But Victor and the board had backed his decision to chair the commission, recognizing that some leadership moments transcended ordinary business concerns. These findings aren't unique to Transglobal, James continued. Our commission reviewed practices across 12 major airlines and found similar issues to varying degrees in all of them. This is an industry-wide challenge that requires industry-wide solutions. In the months following the incident, other passengers had come forward with their own stories, often backed by video evidence. What had once been dismissed as isolated incidents or subjective passenger grievances had been revealed as a pattern affecting thousands of travelers yearly. The Department of Transportation's investigation had expanded, and Congress had held hearings where James had testified alongside other affected passengers. Our recommendations begin with a complete overhaul of training programs, James explained. The old approach of brief diversity training sessions has proven ineffective. Instead, we're recommending ongoing coaching, clear metrics for respectful treatment of all passengers, and accountability systems with real consequences. Near the back of the room sat Beth, the flight attendant from James's flight. After being placed on administrative leave, she had gone through a period of reflection that led her to become an unexpected advocate for change. She had publicly acknowledged that her reaction that day had been shaped by subtle biases in her training and the airline's culture. Rather than being made a scapegoat, she had become part of the solution, providing valuable insights into how frontline staff were trained to handle various situations. Perhaps most importantly, James continued, we're recommending that airlines revise their core metrics for success. When staff are evaluated primarily on speed and efficiency, rather than quality of interaction, we create systems where passengers are seen as obstacles rather than human beings deserving respect. The room was completely silent as he spoke. Even the reporters, usually tapping away at their laptops, were fully engaged. Transglobal Airways has committed to implementing all 27 recommendations in our report, James announced. And 7 other major airlines have already followed suit. This represents a fundamental shift in how nearly 80% of American air travelers will be treated going forward. Kimberly Wells rose to join James at the podium. 6 months earlier, they had been adversaries in a tense meeting as a crisis unfolded. Today they stood together as partners in transformation. Transglobal Airways is a different company today than it was 6 months ago, Wells stated clearly. Our stock price is still recovering, and we've lost the trust of many passengers. Those are consequences we must accept. But we're committed to becoming the industry leader in respectful, equitable customer service. As Wells spoke, James reflected on the unexpected turn his life had taken. What had begun as a business trip had evolved into a nationwide conversation about dignity and respect. The investor meeting he'd been traveling to that day had become a footnote. River Edge had secured its funding through other channels while James focused on the commission work. After the formal presentation concluded, Priya Kumar, the whistleblower whose courage had helped expose the systemic issues, approached James. When I decided to release those documents, I was horrified, she admitted. I thought I was ending my career. I never imagined it would lead to actual change. Sometimes the right action doesn't feel safe, James replied. But it's still the right action. As the crowd began to disperse, a young flight attendant in training stopped James. Mr. Wilson, I joined Transglobal 3 months ago because of what happened. I wanted to be part of a company that was trying to do better, not just talk about it. These encounters had become common for James, people sharing how the incident had affected them or inspired them to speak up about their own experiences. Each story reinforced his belief that the difficult journey had been worthwhile. Later that evening, James finally returned home to Leah and their children. 6 months of commuting between Chicago, Washington, D.C., and home had taken a toll on family time, but they had supported his decision every step of the way. Dad, Zoe called out as he walked through the door. Your report was on the news. My teacher showed it in class today. James smiled, hugging his daughter. What did you think? I think it's cool that something bad turned into something good. She replied with the straightforward wisdom of a 13-year-old. Leah joined them, wrapping her arms around James. Proud of you, she said simply. Later that night, after the kids were asleep, James and Leah sat on their back porch looking up at the stars. What happens now? Leah asked. Back to normal life? James considered the question. I'm not sure normal looks the same anymore. The commission work will continue with ongoing monitoring. There are still congressional hearings scheduled, and River Edge needs my full attention again. "You've made a real difference," Leah said. "Not many people get to say that." James thought about Beth, about Kimberly Wells, about Priya Kumar, each changed in their own way by what had happened that day on the plane. He thought about the flight attendants who had risked their jobs to speak out, and the executives who had finally acknowledged problems they'd long ignored. "It wasn't just me," he said. "It was everyone who decided that respect and dignity weren't optional extras but basic requirements. The flight attendants who spoke up, the passengers who recorded what happened, the whistleblower who risked everything, even Beth, who eventually found the courage to acknowledge her part in it." His phone buzzed with a message from Victor. "Just saw the commission report release on the news. Well done. Board meeting tomorrow to discuss your transition back to full-time River Edge duties. The new investors are eager to meet you." Life was returning to something resembling normal, but permanently changed by what had happened. Transglobal Airways continued its slow recovery, though industry analysts predicted it would take years to fully rebuild passenger trust. The airline industry as a whole had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about how it treated certain passengers. New regulations were being considered at the federal level, and it had all begun with a drink cart and a request for a simple apology. As James looked up at the night sky, he reflected on how quickly life could change, how a single moment could spark a transformation that affected countless lives. He thought about all the people who had experienced similar treatment, but lacked the platform to make their voices heard. The work wasn't finished, but it had begun in earnest. "You know," Leah said, interrupting his thoughts, "I just realized something." "What's that?" James asked. "You never actually got that apology for being hit with the drink cart." James laughed. A genuine, heartfelt laugh that released the tension of the past 6 months. "No, I didn't," he agreed, "but I got something much more meaningful instead." As they sat together under the stars, James felt a sense of peace that had been elusive since that day on the plane. The airline had imploded, yes, but from those ashes something better was rising. An industry being rebuilt with respect and dignity at its foundation, rather than as an afterthought. And that was worth far more than any apology could ever be.